Hi, I'm Steve Whitty. Welcome to Atheists Speak Up. My guest today is Ann Burton. We'll be talking about Star Trek, and Star Trek from a peculiar angle. Ann, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
So why don't we get into it? What angle are we going for in this little talk?
We're going to be talking about Star Trek, humanism, theology, and what Star Trek really was about back in the 60s, as well as subsequent
So Gene
series.
Roddenberry had a plan. It wasn't just a rodeo in space.
Yes, Gene was interesting. Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, actually thought about initially doing something different. He was really about not conforming to what the standards and practices were about at the time. So initially his plan was, I'm going to write about women doing different things. They were not going to have the standard roles as in his previous shows. He was going to talk about showing the philosophy that he had kind of developed on his own. And that is what he did. And he was also about rewriting other people's screenplays so it would fit his philosophy.
Yeah, I think we'll get into that. So let's start with some of his earlier background. He had some military experience.
Right. He was a World War II bomber pilot, and he also flew for Pan Am and was deadheading one time, and the plane crashed, and he was credited as saving a number of folks from that plane crash.
For Pan Am.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. And of course he went on to join the Los Angeles police force, and he rose up to the position as the writer for the police department and for the commissioner. And it's probably during that time that he began submitting screenplays to Hollywood and got noticed in that form.
He was in California, right? So
At that time, by that time. He was born in Texas, actually, and then the family moved to California. And I believe his father was a police officer, and certainly it's not a surprise that he was following in his father's footsteps. So he was actually a motorcycle police officer. But as I said, he eventually started writing the speeches for the police commissioner.
yeah, I can hardly imagine him on a motorcycle.
He was a pretty large guy. He was pretty imposing, actually.
I bet.
So, and then of course he had certain shows that didn't do quite well, Quester Tapes and The Lieutenant, to name a few. But this idea, I guess, rattled around in his head for a while. And in 1964, he was able to get a pilot submitted to the powers that be, so to speak. And unfortunately, they didn't quite like it.
They turned him down.
Pretty much. And the story goes that it was considered too cerebral, although there's various other opinions about what actually happened. But in 1964, his show, The Cage, was not accepted.
Okay.
But he was given another shot. He was given a second chance at a pilot, and in 1966, NBC, Desilu Productions actually placed their show on their schedule.
So Desilu, for our audience that isn't in the business, Desi is Desi Arnaz.
Correct, and Lucille Ball.
And Lucille Ball, right?
Right.
So, so they actually produced the show, really.
That's right. That's right.
So it says Desilu on in the opening credits, and I think when I was 7 and saw that, I paid no attention to it, not even a little.
Right. But in retrospect, it was pretty significant at the time. Lucy wasn't exactly as involved as some people think. Again, a lot of controversy over how much really was her decision. At one point, she thought Star Trek was a USO show. So she actually didn't really realize what the story was actually about. But Gene Roddenberry was able to sell the show as a wagon train to the stars. And because Westerns were such a hit at that time, he was able to really use Star Trek and use science fiction as a way of getting his philosophy across.
And sort of under the radar.
Oh yes, he was very, very proud
Yeah.
of that. He was very proud that while other people at the time, I don't know if you remember the Smothers Brothers, there were people who were doing shows and making comments about the Vietnam War and other issues, and they got a little bit in trouble. He was quite proud that he was able to use Star Trek to convey his concepts about such things as the war.
Yeah. So he hired top-notch writers. I remember Harlan Ellison,
Right.
for example,
Right.
but others as well.
Well, yes, but what he wound up doing, though, was rewriting a lot of these people's stories. So Harlan Ellison, for example, who wrote Sitting on the Edge of Forever, you actually have two versions. You have Harlan's version and Gene Roddenberry's version. He changed the story quite a bit. And Harlan, for the rest of his life, never quite forgave Roddenberry, and actually wrote a book about that episode being changed, even though both of those episodes won science fiction awards. Both versions.
So his own version
Right.
he railed against.
Right. But what's interesting about Roddenberry is when you look at his life in reference to atheism, he actually talks about in a later interview conducted by David Alexander over a series of visits, Gene Roddenberry talks about growing up and being in church. His mother took the kids to church. Wasn't a big thing, wasn't really a true, full religious family. The father never quite went to church. But he talks about just being there and looking at girls. He just had a lot of fun with that. But when he looked at the church and the concept of the service changing water into wine, he actually, even as a child, thought it was cannibalism. And I thought that's pretty interesting for
Yeah.
a young person to make that connection.
Yeah, I didn't make that connection until it was pointed out to me, and I was 45.
Exactly.
And then, having been pointed out to me, I saw it on it happened to be a Roman Catholic church sign where it was explicitly cannibalism. I
Wow.
couldn't believe it.
Right.
I took a picture of it. I might have it somewhere.
And I have to admit, I didn't really think about it. It didn't seem right. There was a song called Sons of God, and the words were, "Eat his body, drink his blood, and we'll sing a song of love." That's when it started to hit me, that it didn't seem quite
Yeah.
right. But anyway, he talks about that as something that he picked up. And so he made it a point that the writers would kind of stay away from religion and you don't see very much of it discussed in the original series.
Not directly.
Correct.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of indirect.
Indirectly, yes.
Yes.
Not directly.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, the one episode that people always want to talk about is the episode Bread and Circuses, where Gene credits. It's the writing is supposed to be his, and it's still debatable if that's the thing. But there was a discussion in that episode that God was used. And of course, Uhura, the character Uhura, played by Nichelle Nichols, says this at the end of the episode, that the discussion through that episode was about a parallel universe where Rome had not ended, had continued, the Roman Empire, that is, and that there were sun worshippers, supposedly, and that they were always talking about the message of the sun. And if you're as an audience viewer, you were led to believe that it was about the sun, S-U-N, in the sky. And Uhura at the end gets to correct them and say, no, you're wrong, all of you. It's not the sun up in the sky, it's the Son of God. But the point in there that is always part of the discussion is that the characters who were so-called sun worshipers, again, kept talking about the message of the sun. And the message of the sun, as one character in the episode talks about, is that all men are brothers, and I didn't believe it. And Kirk, as everyone knows probably, that William Shatner plays Kirk, gets to tell this character that you keep on believing it. It is true. All men and women, all men are brothers.
It was
So-
the 60s after all.
Well, there's a lot of sexism, misogyny in the original series, but that's for another time. That's for another
It's a
show.
different topic.
But yes, so
Yeah.
that is what a lot of people point out is, well, see, he mentions God in that episode. He couldn't possibly have been agnostic or atheist. And we, again, think that it was more about the message. And regardless of whether you are a believer, a religious person or not, the message that we should be kind and treat each other as equal and as individuals is certainly not incongruous, and it certainly doesn't take away from not believing in a religion or not believing in a entity.
Yeah, do you have a favorite episode? I know that's not where this is going, but I just thought, I was just wondering.
Well, in keeping with the topic, we're with humanism and atheism, what Roddenberry always liked to point out was, in fact, that episode, Bread and Circuses, that I just mentioned, and in the Next Generation, which was the next series that began in 1987, he talks about Who Watches the Watchers, even though he did not write that episode. And Who Watches the Watchers was about a proto-Vulcan race, a humanoid Vulcan race of people who were still impressionable, and although they were trying to use logic. And a duck blind, which had some Starfleet folks watching this race of people, fell apart. It became
Had technical problems.
exactly, and it became revealed to these folks, and they saw someone beam up, and they heard the word Picard, and started to worship essentially the Picard. And throughout the episode, the folks on the ship, Picard, who was the captain, I'm sure most of the audience knows, in the Next Generation series, has to convince the folks, the Mintakans, was the race of people, that he wasn't a god, but he was simply more advanced in science and technology than they were. And in fact, if they kept on the way they were going in development, would also reach a point where they would also have this technology. So it wasn't magical, it wasn't something to worship, it was simply the fact that he had knowledge and abilities that they didn't. And for a lot of people and a lot of races, and throughout our history on the planet, one of the reasons that people will worship is because there is something that they didn't have or are not familiar with or have not seen before. It usually involves something that is unique, and where in fact it comes out to be something that has a scientific explanation, let's just say, or
Sure.
a technical explanation. And so it was very interesting, and he was quite proud, Roddenberry was quite proud of this episode, as well as Bread and Circuses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could believe that. So we had other godlike figures, especially in the original series, but
Right.
other series as well.
Right. Back to the original series, there were a couple of situations where God was in fact a machine. And the machine was actually running the race or running the planet. And again, this is where you talk about technology and how technology was seen in the 60s and the fears of technology. That again, if it was something that was unknown or something you couldn't control or something beyond the everyday, then it was something to worship. But in fact, it was in fact simply a machine. So you have episodes like Return of the Archons and The World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky. in both of those situations, the machine is running the planet or running a race of beings, and the machine is faltering, and Starfleet, and in this case Captain Kirk and his folks, have to come and fix the machine. But at the same time, he also has to reveal that to the folks that this is a machine.
The machine exists.
Okay, and therefore challenging their belief systems, and it goes to the core of each of these civilizations. And so that's the case in both of those episodes.
Yeah. So we have the will of Landru.
The will of Landru. And what's interesting about that's the Archons, Return of the Archons. There's no mention of a god in that episode. You
That's
just
right.
have the lawgivers who are dressed in monk-type uniforms.
They've got a cloak over their head. And
Cloak
everything.
over their heads, and they have this long rod, and they're shoving it or shooting this kind of
shooting
machine.
stuff out of it, and
exactly.
and eventually the rod is revealed to be like just an empty tube.
Exactly.
It's
when
not
you look
even
at it, it's
yeah,
just a hollow
it
tube.
had nothing to do with
right?
the rod.
But what is very frightening, I should say, yes, frightening about that episode is the control. And the control involving other people, the people on the planet who were under this control and would actually report anyone else who was not in control. And we see this in a lot of religions today.
We see it in politics too.
Again, another topic for another time. But you're right. Yeah, absolutely. The control issue, where in that case, when Dr. McCoy, another person, part of the Starfleet crew, becomes influenced and sees someone else that's not influenced, he reports them. And I can think of so many religions where that is the case, where family members are ostracized, are reported, are singled out, who are brought in front of whatever the congregation is. And they are, in terms of, let's say, the Catholic Church, excommunicated or sent out.
Yeah.
And that, to me, was quite frightening when we saw that in that episode.
Yeah, I have a little different take on it. By the time I was in high school, I'd already moved 4 times, and now I've moved 17 times. So, and I'm not talking about just down the street or to the next town necessarily. I'm talking about usually to another state.
Wow.
So I don't have, for the most part, I don't have the ties.
Mm-hmm.
So if my neighbors are pissy, well, I don't need them. And I really don't need them.
Right.
But that's not the norm.
Right.
In high school, I met a guy, there was one of the other kids, had never left town. He'd only been out of town once, and that's because the town did not have a hospital. So he was born outside of the town, and he only crossed the boundary to get into town to go home. And by high school, so he's
My
like
goodness.
16 or so, he had never left. Now, I was on the cross-country team, so I had run out of town in every single direction. I was on foot, right? And I just thought, oh, it was so weird that this guy had never gone anywhere. But that is, in fact, the norm. Mm-hmm. I'm the weirdo. I didn't realize that until quite a bit later.
Right, right. Yeah, so control is one of those aspects of religion, which reminds me of the 3rd series, Deep Space Nine, which was conceived by Ira Bear. Just celebrated their 25th anniversary, and he's come out with a fantastic 2-hour video in celebration of his 7-year show. Mm-hmm. And what we see in that series, 7 years series, is religion everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah.
Discussing all kinds of aspects, including control. And we get to see a planet whose hierarchy was basically religious. And at one point, even their head of their religion was also the head of the planet. That didn't last very long. But they have a full, as I said, hierarchy of religious leaders that goes all the way to the Kai, which looks like the equivalent of the Pope when you think about it.
Sort of, yeah.
And the Vedics were the equivalent of the cardinals. And so from that Vedic pool, you would have your Chi. And in this case, we see Academy Award winner Louise Fletcher emerge as the Kai Wynn, who basically is supposed to be the religious and spiritual leader of the planet. And we get to see religion in a whole other way.
Sure.
She, at one episode, comes and visits a school and is very, very judgmental of the teacher there, who is talking about the wormhole from a scientific point of view, and the Chi accuses her of spreading heresy and sacrilege. I mean, we know about this, the whole problem with science and religion and the fights between the two. But the other aspect of that episode is that she is using this controversy. She actually creates the controversy and comes to the school and uses it so that she can become the Chi. And it's a religious battle between her and another Vedic who was actually more popular at the time. So it had a lot of different levels, and it was pretty interesting to see this aspect of religion that a lot of people don't really think about and haven't really seen portrayed, and particularly in the 80s when this series came out.
Right.
It was quite different.
I remember disliking the Kai character quite a bit, but later I recognized that, oh, this is excellent acting.
Yes. Yes.
I
And we
mean,
all
seriously.
know Louise Fletcher from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest as Nurse Ratched.
Okay.
So that duplicity comes in handy.
Yeah.
And it was quite interesting. She also knew about an attempt on the Vedic's life. She knew about it. She didn't do anything about it. She seemed to encourage it. I mean, it was all this underlying and duplicitous behavior that some religions have, if not most.
One of the things that I liked about Deep Space Nine was that there was a story arc. There was that spanned more than just one episode. You didn't just have an episode. They beam down to a planet, they do something, and then they beam back up to the ship. Things happened, and things that happened changed the course of the show, right? You'd have a new character occasionally come in or leave or something, but there were changes and they were permanent. You also got to see Jake Sisko grow up, so there were other things that happened.
Right.
So,
there's one episode where Jake, who is the son of the Commander Sisko, has his son who is in this class from this teacher, and that same episode, Jake says all this kind of religion is stupid. And Commander Sisko says, wait a minute, this belief system is what kept these folks together. So we're talking about a planet, it was called Bajor, and the Bajorans were under attack and under control of the Cardassians, not Kim Kardashian, but the Cardassians, and they needed all their strength. And you see this aspect of religion, of folks using their beliefs to give them what they felt was strength to deal with the problems. And in many places around the world, religion does that for folks, for some people.
Sure. Let me see. The movies we have.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's funny that religion isn't that much discussed as in the series, in the television series. But in the movies, it's kind of funny because there's the first movie that came out thanks to Star Wars. Star Trek was allowed to become a movie back in 1979, and it featured this, again, machine, V'ger, that is basically looking for its creator. So I've always kind of nicknamed, or I've always kind of gave the first Star Trek movie the subtitle In Search of God. So the creator is basically the machine is V'ger is in search of God and in search of his creator. And this search and this emptiness, because this machine has gathered all the knowledge you could possibly have and is still wanting. There's something out there, there's something more. And that was this human touch, this humanity. It's something that Spock, the character Spock, again, I think is quite familiar to the audience, is looking for and actually recognizes. And the machine also has to do that as well. That it's fine to have all this technology, but don't forget your humanity.
Sure.
And
sure.
that is something that Spock initially was trying to run away from because he was half human. So all through the original series, he's having this fight between his Vulcan half and his human half.
Okay, so we've got about a minute to wrap up. Any last words that you have?
Well, I think that there is some discussion that the atheism in Star Trek is not really of any interest, and it's really not what we think of when we think of Star Trek. People think of Star Trek as basically a fantasy or poor brother to the Marvel comics, for example. But I really think that folks should give those 5 series, a 6 series, another look, and particularly the later ones, Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. They have a lot to say.
My initial impression of Star Trek in general was that it was progressive. I might not have used that when I was 7, but that's what I was thinking. And that was the first words out of my mouth when I was asked about it.
Right, right. It was something that even Roddenberry himself admitted. It was something he evolved into.
And I see progressiveness as something that comes out of atheism in general. So that's our show. Thanks for watching, everyone. This has been Atheists Speak Up.